life turned into a nightmare the moment the first message from an unknown number appeared on my phone screen. At that time, I didn't yet understand that this was the beginning of the end, the beginning of an endless cycle of horror from which there was no escape. But let's start from the beginning. My name is Alexei Morozov. I'm 32 years old, and until that fateful day, my life was ordinary, dull, and predictable. I worked as a programmer in a small IT company, rented a one-room apartment in a Moscow residential area, and my only entertainment was evening walks along deserted streets after work. I was lonely, withdrawn, and perfectly content with it. My parents died in a car accident 5 years ago. I had practically no friends, and my last relationship with a girl ended more than a year ago. My life resembled a mechanical clock, each day repeated with minute precision. In the morning, I woke up at exactly 7, drank a cup of instant coffee, showered, and went to work. The journey to the office took exactly 40 minutes by metro. I would get into the 5th car, stand by the second door on the left, and read news on my phone, trying not to look at other passengers. At work, I debugged software code, rarely spoke to colleagues, and ate lunch alone in a cafe across from the office. In the evening, I returned home by the same route, bought convenience food at the store near my house, and spent the rest of the day at my computer playing old quests or reading forums. This routine had lasted for several years, and I had grown accustomed to the monotony, even finding a kind of solace in it. But on the evening of October 23rd, something changed. I was returning home as usual, and as I ascended the stairs to the 4th floor, my phone vibrated. I pulled it out of my pocket, expecting to see another promotional message or bank notification, but instead, an unknown number and a strange message appeared on the screen. Now you will stop on the landing between the 3rd and 4th floors, look at the skull graffiti on the wall, and think about how life is passing you by. I froze, reread the message several times, and a chill ran down my spine. The thing was, that was exactly what I had been about to do. Every day climbing these stairs, I stopped on that landing, examined that graffiti, and thought precisely that. At first, I decided it was someone's silly joke. Perhaps a neighbor had noticed my habit and decided to play a trick. But who? I barely interacted with the building's residents, only greeting an elderly neighbor, Aunt Vera, who could barely use a mobile phone. The other residents were complete strangers to me. I tried to dismiss the strange coincidence and continued up the stairs, but anxiety had already settled in my soul. At home, I reread the message several times, trying to find some clue. But the number was completely unfamiliar, and the message itself contained no identifying marks. The next 2 days passed peacefully, and I had almost forgotten about the strange message, attributing it to chance or someone's failed joke. But on Friday, as I sat in the cafe opposite the office, eating my usual borscht and cutlet for lunch, my phone vibrated again. This time, the message was even more precise. You are sitting at the table by the window. In front of you is a plate of borscht in which you are stirring sour cream counterclockwise. In 30 seconds, the waitress Marina will trip over a chair leg and spill coffee on the floor. I looked at my plate. Indeed, I was at that very moment stirring sour cream counterclockwise. My heart pounded faster, and I involuntarily looked at the waitress named Marina. I knew her name because I had eaten here every day for several years. She was carrying a tray of coffee to a nearby table, and I started counting the seconds. 28, 29, 30. And at that exact moment, Marina tripped over a protruding chair leg and spilled coffee on the floor. I rushed out of the cafe without finishing my lunch and quickly walked towards the office. But my thoughts were muddled and my hands trembled. Someone was following me, that was obvious. But who and why? I wasn't a rich person, had no enemies, and wasn't involved in anything reprehensible. My life was so boring and predictable that following me would be pointless. Nevertheless, the facts spoke otherwise. Someone was not only observing me, but could predict my actions with pinpoint accuracy. I spent the rest of the workday in tension, constantly looking over my shoulder and trying to understand which of the people around me could be my pursuer. But all my colleagues behaved as usual. No one paid any particular attention to me. In the evening, I decided to change my usual route home and took a different path, making a detour through the city center. I went into various stores, changed direction several times, even deliberately went into a shopping mall and wandered around for half an hour, watching reflections in the display windows. I didn't notice anyone suspicious, and that frightened me even more. If I was indeed being followed, it was being done so professionally that I couldn't detect the surveillance. I got home only at 9 in the evening, tired and tense. I checked all the locks on the door, drew the curtains, and decided not to leave the house during the weekend. Perhaps if I changed my routine, these strange messages would stop, but Saturday brought a new nightmare. I woke up at 9:30 in the morning, which was completely uncharacteristic of me. I usually woke up at 7, even on weekends. Before I could even get out of bed, my phone vibrated. You woke up 20 minutes later than usual because you couldn't fall asleep last night worrying about the messages. Now you will go to the kitchen, open the refrigerator, and find that the milk has gone sour. You will be upset because you won't be able to drink coffee with milk, as you are used to. I slowly got out of bed, my legs trembling with fear. Indeed, I had fallen asleep only around 2 in the morning, constantly replaying the events of the past few days in my head. With trembling hands, I opened the refrigerator and took out the milk carton. It had indeed gone sour, even though the expiration date had not yet passed. I dropped the carton, and the sour milk spilled across the kitchen floor. This day marked the beginning of my true nightmare. Messages arrived every few hours, and each one described my actions with terrifying precision. The unknown sender knew not only what I was doing, but also what I was thinking and feeling. He knew that I liked to scratch my left ear when I was nervous, that I always washed dishes clockwise, that before bed I always checked if the door was locked, even if I had checked it a minute ago. He knew about my most intimate habits, which no one else in the world knew. Gradually, I realized that attempts to change my routine were pointless. The sender somehow knew my plans in advance and described even those actions I was performing for the first time. Sunday turned into sheer hell. I didn't leave the apartment, drew all the curtains, disconnected from the internet, and even removed the batteries from all electronic devices except my phone. But the messages kept coming. They described how I sat in the corner of the room, knees hugged to my chest, how my fingers trembled, how I counted cracks on the ceiling, trying to distract myself from obsessive thoughts. The sender knew I had counted 23 cracks, that the longest one reminded me of my deceased mother's profile, that I was crying, remembering her voice. These details were so personal, so painful, that I felt completely exposed to this unknown persecutor. By Sunday evening, I decided to contact the police. I collected all the messages, took screenshots, and wrote down the phone number. But when I arrived at the station on Monday morning, the duty officer just shrugged. He said that technically there was no threat in the messages, that it could just be someone's joke, and advised me to block the number. I tried to explain that it wasn't about threats, but about someone monitoring me with incredible accuracy. But the officer clearly didn't take my problem seriously. He took down my statement, but warned that without specific threats or proof of surveillance, they were unlikely to do anything. I left the station even more depressed than before. Attempting to block the number proved pointless. Messages continued to arrive, but now from different numbers. Sometimes they were Russian numbers, sometimes foreign, sometimes numbers didn't even display. But the style of the messages remained unchanged. The same frightening level of detail, the same ability to predict my actions. I realized I was dealing with someone who possessed serious technical capabilities. Perhaps it was a hacker who had somehow gained access to my devices and surveillance cameras in the city. But even this theory didn't explain how he could know my thoughts and feelings. The work week became a real ordeal. I constantly looked over my shoulder, jumped at every sound, couldn't concentrate on work. Colleagues started noticing my strange behavior. My boss, Igor Petrovich, called me into his office and asked if everything was all right. I couldn't tell him the truth. Who would believe such a story? So I lied that I had health problems, that I wasn't sleeping well and was therefore distracted. Igor Petrovich advised me to take a vacation and focus on my health, but I refused. Work was the only place where I could somehow distract myself from the nightmare that had engulfed my life. But even at work, the messages didn't stop. They came during meetings describing how I nervously fidgeted with my pen, how I avoided eye contact with colleagues, how I counted minutes until the end of the workday. The sender knew that I was secretly in love with our system administrator, Anna, although I never showed it. He knew that every day I deliberately walked past her workstation, hoping for a casual glance. He knew about my fantasies, about how I imagined inviting her on a date, though in reality I lacked the courage to even say hello to her. These revelations were so humiliating that I felt like a worm being examined under a microscope. A week after the nightmare began, I decided to try and find out who was behind these messages. I installed several call tracking apps on my phone, started photographing all suspicious people on the street, even hired a private detective. The detective, an elderly man named Valery Ivanovich, listened to my story with unconcealed skepticism but agreed to take the case for a substantial fee. He checked my apartment for hidden cameras, examined my phone and computer, and even spent several days observing me. But he found no evidence of surveillance. There were no cameras in the apartment. The phone and computer were clean of malicious software, and during the observation, the detective noticed no one suspicious. Valery Ivanovich suggested that I might have mental health issues, that I was sending these messages to myself and then forgetting about it. This theory enraged me, and I kicked the detective out, demanding my money back. But his words stuck in my head, and I began to doubt my own sanity. Maybe I really was going crazy? Perhaps stress and loneliness had led me to hallucinations. I made an appointment with a psychiatrist, but the doctor found no serious disorders. He prescribed mild sedatives and advised me to socialize more, exercise, and find a hobby. Simple advice for a complex problem, but the messages kept coming and they became increasingly sinister. Now the sender not only described my actions but also gave advice, warnings, even commands. He told me not to eat salad at the cafe on Tuesday because I would get an upset stomach. I ignored the warning but indeed got food poisoning and spent the night in the bathroom. He told me not to sit in the first metro car on Wednesday morning because there would be a fight. I deliberately sat in the first car and indeed witnessed a brutal brawl between two passengers. Gradually, I realized that the sender was not just observing me. He somehow knew the future. This thought completely undermined my mental stability. I stopped eating normally, lost 10 kilograms, and barely slept. Dark circles appeared under my eyes, my hands constantly trembled, I started to stutter. Colleagues whispered behind my back, and Igor Petrovich called me in again and strongly recommended I take a vacation. This time I agreed, realizing that in such a state I couldn't work properly. But the vacation brought no relief. The messages continued to come, and now they described how I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, how I talked to myself, how I cried from helplessness and fear. One evening, as I sat in the kitchen with a cup of cold tea, a message came that changed everything. You think you're going crazy, but you're not. You think you're being followed, but that's not it either. The truth is much scarier than you can imagine. Tomorrow at 3:47 p.m. you will find out who I am. Prepare for a shock. I reread this message dozens of times, trying to understand what it meant. For the first time, the sender promised to reveal his identity. I didn't sleep all night, tormented by curiosity and fear simultaneously. The next day, Thursday, I spent in nervous anticipation. Every minute I looked at my watch, counting down the time until the promised moment of truth. At 3:47 p.m., I sat at home, holding my phone in my hands, trembling with tension. Exactly at the appointed time, a message arrived. "Look in the hallway mirror. Look closely." I slowly stood up and walked to the mirror. My reflection was horrifying. A gaunt face, dull eyes, disheveled hair. I looked like a madman. But suddenly, I noticed something strange. In the mirror, I saw myself not only as I was now, but also somehow different. Older, with gray hair, deep wrinkles, with sad, wise eyes. It lasted only a moment, but I distinctly saw that other reflection. My phone vibrated again. "Do you understand now? It's me sending you messages. I am you, just from the future. I'm stuck in a time loop and trying to warn you about what will happen. But every time, everything repeats itself. Every time I hope I can change the course of events, but time is relentless. Soon you will understand what I mean. Soon you will become me." I dropped the phone and it clattered to the floor. My heart was beating so fast that I feared it would stop. A time loop? Me from the future? It was madness, but strangely it explained everything that was happening. Only I could know such details about myself. Only I could predict my actions with such accuracy. But how was this possible? How could messages be sent from the future to the past? I didn't believe in mysticism. I had always been a rationalist, but the facts spoke for themselves. The next message finally convinced me of the impossible truth. "You are currently thinking about how your mother sang you a lullaby about the little gray wolf when you were 5 years old. You remember how she stroked your head and how you felt completely safe. This memory surfaced now because you desperately want to feel protected like then. But there is no more protection, Alexei. There is only the time loop from which there is no escape." I collapsed to the floor, sobbing like a child. This memory had indeed surfaced in my mind at the very moment I read the message. No one but myself could know about it. No one could know what I was thinking at that very second. So it was true. So I was indeed receiving messages from my future self. But what did this mean for me? What awaited me? And most importantly, could the future be changed if one knew about it beforehand? The following days turned into a ceaseless dialogue with my future self. I no longer feared the messages. On the contrary, I devoured them, trying to understand the nature of the time loop I was trapped in. My future self proved to be a surprisingly patient teacher, explaining the mechanics of this nightmare. He told me that the loop began on the day of my death, October 31st, exactly 1 week after the first message. I died at 6:30 in the evening from a heart attack caused by nervous exhaustion and constant stress. But instead of simply dying, I entered a closed time loop, where events repeat over and over again. Each time the loop restarts, I retain memories of previous cycles, but my past self remains unchanged. I try to warn myself to alter the course of events, but time seems to resist any attempts at modification. Even when I know what will happen, I cannot prevent it. Moreover, my very attempts to change the future become part of the immutable cycle. I am condemned to relive these 8 days again and again, witnessing my slow descent into madness and inevitable death. My future self recounted the details of how the loop began. It turns out that there is something in my apartment I never noticed. An antique mirror in the hallway, inherited from my grandmother. This mirror was crafted in the 19th century by a strange artisan named Vasily the Dark, who was rumored to engage in occult practices. The mirror possesses the ability to create temporal anomalies, especially when a person experiences severe emotional stress on the verge of death. That's why I saw my future reflection in it. The mirror showed me who I would become in the time loop. This information initially seemed like madness, but my future self provided proof. He described where to find documents about the mirror's origin, in an old box in the mezzanine whose existence I had forgotten. Indeed, my grandmother's papers were there, including a strange note in Old Church Slavonic, which she received along with the mirror. The note warned that the mirror was capable of returning the souls of those not ready for transition, and contained instructions for its consecration to prevent a curse. Grandmother obviously didn't take it seriously, just like me until recently, but the most terrifying discovery awaited me. My future self informed me that I was not the first to enter this loop. The mirror holds the souls of several people who died in a state of extreme emotional tension. Each of them lives their last days over and over, and each tries to warn their past self about the coming catastrophe. But none of them have managed to break the cycle. The mirror feeds on their suffering, their despair, their endless attempts to change the unchangeable. I began to research the mirror's history more thoroughly. It turned out that Vasily the Dark did indeed exist. He was known in Moscow as a skilled mirror maker, but there were also rumors of his connections to dark forces. It was said that he created mirrors not only to show reflections, but also to peer into other worlds, into other times. Police records from the 18th century contained several mentions of strange incidents in houses where his mirrors were located. People went mad seeing reflections of what shouldn't have been there. Some disappeared without a trace, leaving only notes saying they were stuck between worlds. My future self explained that the loop has its own laws. It lasts exactly 8 days, starting from the moment of receiving the first message and ending with my death. Each cycle is absolutely identical to the previous one, except that I retain memories of past cycles. But these memories do not help me change events. They only amplify my despair. I know what will happen, but I cannot prevent it. Moreover, the very knowledge of the future becomes part of the loop, forcing me to act exactly as I have acted countless times before. Particularly agonizing was the realization that I myself was the cause of my nightmare. If I hadn't panicked, hadn't driven myself to nervous exhaustion, perhaps the loop would never have begun. But now it was too late. My future self told me that he had already lived this cycle 73 times, and each time he hoped that something would change. But there are no changes, only an endless repetition of the same 8 days of horror. I tried to destroy the mirror, but it proved indestructible. The hammer bounced off its surface, leaving not even a scratch. Acid did it no harm. Fire could not melt it. The mirror seemed to exist in another dimension where the laws of physics did not apply. Moreover, any attempt to get rid of it led to strange consequences. When I tried to take the mirror out of the apartment, it always reappeared in its place as if it had never left the hallway. When I tried to cover it with cloth, the cloth disappeared after a few hours, leaving no trace. Gradually, I realized that the mirror doesn't just show a reflection, it shows the truth. In it, I could see not only my future, but also the past of other people caught in the loop. Sometimes other faces appeared in the reflection, men and women of different eras, all with the same expression of hopeless despair. They tried to tell me something, but I couldn't hear them. I saw their lips forming silent words, saw their eyes full of pleas for help. But I couldn't help them, just as I couldn't help myself. My future self told me what happens in the moments between cycles. When the loop ends with my death, I enter a strange place, a gray space where time has stopped. There I meet the mirror's other victims, and we all try to find a way to break the cycle. But this place is not meant for the living. It drains our life force, makes us more and more ghostly. Each new cycle takes a piece of my soul, and I understand that sooner or later nothing will remain of me but an empty shell, condemned to eternal repetition of the same days. The most terrifying thing in this story was that I began to lose touch with reality. The boundary between cycles blurred, and I could no longer understand which time I was experiencing these events. Sometimes it seemed like I was in the first cycle, sometimes in the 100th. Memories of different cycles mixed in my head, creating a chaotic mosaic of repeating events. I remembered how many times I had read the same messages, how many times I had fallen to the hallway floor, How many times I had cried from helplessness and despair. But worst of all, I began to lose the ability to feel. Emotions dulled with each new cycle, and what once terrified me now seemed commonplace. I mechanically went through familiar events, knowing in advance every word, every gesture, every thought. It was like watching the same movie hundreds of times in a row. At first it seems interesting, then boring, then unbearable, and then it simply ceases to be perceived as something real. My future self warned me that this was the mirror's true purpose, not just to trap the soul in a time loop, but to completely absorb it, strip it of individuality, turn it into faceless energy. Each cycle is another step towards complete dissolution in the mirror space. When the process is complete, only an empty shell will remain of me, mechanically repeating the same actions but without awareness, without will, without hope of liberation. I tried to find information about other victims of the mirror, but it proved almost impossible. Most records were destroyed or lost, and those that survived were so fragmented that it was difficult to understand anything from them. But I did find out something. In the 19th century, a young noblewoman, Elizaveta Volkonskaya, wrote in her diary about a strange mirror that showed her ghosts of the future. She described how she saw her own death in the reflection, which was supposed to happen a week later. The diary ended on the very day she said she was to die. In the early 20th century, the artist Mikhail Dobronravov created a series of paintings he called Reflections of Time. These paintings depicted people looking into a mirror and seeing not their own reflection but some other scenes. Contemporaries considered these paintings the product of a sick imagination, but now I understood that the artist perhaps was one of the mirror's victims. His last painting, The Eighth Day, depicted a person who seemed to dissolve into the mirror surface, becoming part of the mirror itself. My future self told me that the mirror holds the souls of at least 12 people, and each of them has lived their time loop many times. But not all loops are the same. Each person has their own duration, their own circumstances, their own attempts to change fate. For some, the loop lasts a day, for others a month. My loop is relatively short, only 8 days, but it is one of the most intense. The constant stress and nervous tension make each cycle unbearable. Especially agonizing was the realization that I would not be able to warn other people about the mirror. Every time I tried to tell someone about my discovery, the words simply wouldn't come out of my mouth. The mirror seemed to control my ability to speak, preventing me from revealing its secret. I could write about it in a diary, but the entries disappeared after a few hours. I could send an email, but it never reached the recipient. The mirror protected itself, preventing victims from warning others of the impending danger. Gradually, I realized that my situation was hopeless. I cannot break the loop, cannot change the future, cannot even warn other people. All that remains for me is to endlessly repeat the same 8 days, each time losing a piece of my soul, until nothing is left of me. This thought filled me with such despair that I seriously considered suicide. But my future self warned me that it would not help. The mirror would not let me die before the appointed time, and suicide attempts would only increase my suffering. I began to keep a detailed diary of each cycle, recording all the small details, all the nuances, all attempts to change the course of events. Perhaps if I was attentive enough, I would find some pattern, some weakness in the time loop. But the more I wrote, the more I understood that the loop was perfect. Every detail was thought out, every event inevitable. Even my attempts to find a way out became part of the cycle, a predicted and unchangeable part of my destiny. My future self told me that in the next cycle I would try to burn the apartment along with the mirror, but the fire would strangely bypass the mirror, doing it no harm. I would try to consult a priest, but words about the mirror would sound like the ravings of a madman. I would try to leave the city, but the train would break down, and I would be forced to return. Every escape attempt was doomed to failure, every hope of salvation an illusion. The most terrifying discovery was the understanding that the mirror doesn't just trap souls in a loop. It feeds on them. Each cycle gives it energy. Each suffering of the victim makes it stronger. I began to notice that with each new cycle, the mirror became brighter, its reflection clearer, and the visions in it more real. It grows, feeding on our souls, and when it reaches a certain strength, it will be able to go beyond the apartment, trap new victims in loops, create new nightmares. My future self warned me that soon I would cease to be myself. My thoughts would become the mirror's thoughts, my desires, its desires. I would exist only to feed it with my suffering, and when my soul was completely absorbed, the mirror would find a new victim. This process would continue forever, and with each new victim, the mirror would become more powerful. I realized that the end was approaching, not only of my life, but also of my existence as a person. In a few cycles, only an empty shell would remain of me, mechanically repeating the same actions. This thought filled me with such horror that I was ready to do anything to avoid this fate. But my future self knew this and warned me that even despair would become part of the loop, another source of energy for the mirror. The hopelessness was absolute, and that made it even more excruciating. The seventh day of the cycle began with an especially ominous message. My future self wrote to me, "Tomorrow you will die for the last time. After this cycle, your soul will be completely absorbed by the mirror, and you will become part of its consciousness. I am writing to you for the last time because after tomorrow I will no longer exist. Instead of me, there will only be emptiness clothed in my shell. Forgive me for not being able to save you. Forgive me for condemning you to this suffering." This message was so full of despair that I felt something break inside me. For the first time in all these days, I felt not just fear, but an absolute emptiness, as if my soul had already begun to dissolve. I spent the entire day wandering through the apartment like a ghost. My reflection in the mirror became increasingly blurred, as if I was losing the clarity of my own boundaries. Sometimes it seemed to me that I saw not myself in the mirror, but what I was supposed to become, a formless shadow devoid of individuality. The mirror seemed to be preparing for its final absorption, and I could feel it draining the life force from me. Each glance at it took away a piece of my personality. Each reflection made me less real. On the evening of the seventh day, I decided to write a final letter. Not for anyone specific, but just to leave a trace of my existence. I knew the letter would disappear just as all my attempts to contact the outside world had disappeared, but I had to do it. I wrote about my life, about who I was before the nightmare began, about my dreams and fears. I wrote about my parents, about my childhood, about how much I lacked closeness with other people. I wrote that if I had the chance to live my life over again, I would do everything differently. I wouldn't isolate myself, wouldn't be afraid to open up to people, wouldn't waste time on emptiness. But most importantly, I wrote a warning about the mirror. I knew that no one would read these words, but I needed to write them. I described the loop mechanism, the history of the mirror, the fates of other victims. I begged whoever found this letter to destroy the mirror at all costs, not to let it trap new victims in the loop. I wrote that the mirror was growing, becoming stronger, and if it wasn't stopped, it could extend beyond the apartment and turn the entire world into an endless loop of suffering. When I finished writing, it was well past midnight. The last day of my existence as a person had arrived. I felt it in every cell of my body, as if a countdown was burning inside me, marking the remaining hours of my individuality. The mirror pulsed with a strange light, and in its depths I could see shadows moving. Other victims who had already lost their identity and turned into faceless entities, feeding the mirror with their energy. On the morning of the 8th day, I woke up with a feeling that my head was filled with cotton. Thoughts came slowly, as if through a thick fog. I realized that the absorption process had already begun. The mirror was sucking out of me not only life force, but also the ability to think, to feel, to be myself. I struggled out of bed and shuffled to the mirror in the hallway. My reflection was almost transparent, as if I had halfway crossed into the mirror's world. The first message from my future self arrived at 10 in the morning. This is my last message. I feel myself dissolving into the mirror, my thoughts becoming its thoughts, and my will, its will. In a few hours, nothing will be left of me. But I want you to know, even in this nightmare, there is one possibility. If you can break the mirror from within at the moment of your death, when your soul is transitioning into the mirror world, you can free everyone trapped within it. But the price for this will be absolute. Your soul will disappear forever without the possibility of reincarnation or peace. You will simply cease to exist. This message gave me one last hope. Not for salvation, I no longer hoped for that, but for the chance to stop the mirror, to save others from my fate. I realized I had to try, even if the price was the complete disappearance of my soul. Better to cease to exist than to become part of this nightmare for all eternity. I spent the day preparing for the final attempt. I studied the mirror, trying to understand its structure, to find its weak points. I noticed that at the moment of transition between cycles, the mirror became especially vulnerable. Its surface seemed to soften, becoming more pliable. If I could strike it from within at that moment, using the energy of my dying soul, perhaps I could destroy it. But for that, I needed to wait for the exact moment of my death, and in the last seconds of my life, gather all my will, all my hatred for the mirror, and direct them towards its destruction. This was almost impossible. At the moment of death from a heart attack, I would experience unbearable pain. My mind would be clouded and my will weakened. But it was the only chance. In the afternoon, I began to feel the familiar symptoms of an approaching heart attack. Chest pain, difficulty breathing, dizziness. I knew this was the beginning of the end, and I tried to focus on my task. I stood before the mirror and stared into it, building up my hatred for this cursed object. I thought about all my suffering, about lost opportunities, about how the mirror had stolen my life even before I had truly lived it. At 6 o'clock, the chest pain intensified. I fell to my knees before the mirror, clutching my chest and trying to breathe. In the reflection, I saw not only myself, but also the other victims of the mirror. They stood behind me, reaching out to me as if pleading for help. Their faces were distorted with suffering, their eyes full of supplication. I realized they were relying on me, that I was their only chance for liberation. At 6:30, I felt my heart begin to stop. The pain became unbearable and I could barely think, but I forced myself to focus on the mirror, on what I had to do. I saw its surface begin to shimmer, to become less stable. The moment of transition was approaching, the moment of my death and the beginning of a new cycle. When my heart stopped, I felt my soul begin to separate from my body. But instead of letting the mirror swallow me, I gathered all my remaining will and directed it at destroying the cursed object. I felt my soul burning, turning into pure energy of destruction. The pain was unbearable, but I endured, knowing this was my last chance to stop the nightmare. The mirror began to crack. First, a thin crack appeared in the center, then it widened, branched out, covering the entire surface. A strange light burst from the cracks, and I heard the cries of the other victims of the mirror. Not cries of pain, but cries of joy. They felt that their liberation was near, but the mirror resisted. It tried to hold me, to absorb my soul as it had absorbed the souls of other victims. I felt it pulling me into its depths, trying to turn my destructive energy into creative energy, to use my strength for its own restoration. The battle was uneven. I was just one soul against an ancient evil that had fed on suffering for centuries, but then something unexpected happened. The other victims of the mirror, sensing the possibility of liberation, began to help me. Their souls, weakened by years of imprisonment, still retained a spark of humanity, a desire for freedom. They directed the remnants of their energy towards destroying the mirror, and their combined strength proved sufficient to turn the tide of battle. The mirror cracked in half, and a stream of light burst from the fissure, blinding me. I felt my soul dissolving in this light, felt myself disappearing forever. But at the same time, I felt joy and relief. The nightmare was over, the mirror was destroyed, and no one else would become its victim. The last thing I remember is the grateful glances of the other victims of the mirror, who finally found peace. Their souls dissolved in the light, heading to where they were originally destined to be. I knew my soul should have followed them, but I had expended my entire essence on destroying the mirror. Nothing remained of me that could continue to exist in any form. But strangely, at the moment of complete disappearance, I felt not fear, but peace. I knew I had made the right choice, that my sacrifice was not in vain. The mirror was destroyed, its victims freed, and no one else would fall into the time loop. This thought warmed my disappearing soul in the last moments of my existence. The apartment where I lived was found by neighbors a few days later. They discovered my body in the hallway next to the shards of the old mirror. The cause of death was determined to be a heart attack caused by stress. No one could explain how the mirror had shattered. The shards were scattered throughout the hallway as if it had exploded from within. Among my belongings, a strange diary was found, in which I described the time loop and the cursed mirror. Experts considered it the product of a sick imagination, the result of a mental disorder caused by loneliness and stress. The diary was archived as an example of how isolation can lead a person to a complete break from reality, but some details in the diary made those who read it ponder. The descriptions of historical facts about the mirror and its creator turned out to be surprisingly accurate. Vasily the Dark did indeed exist and did create mirrors with unusual properties. The stories about Elizaveta Volkonskaya and the artist Dobron Ravov also turned out to be real, though little known. The mirror shards were collected and sent for examination. It turned out that the glass was made using an ancient technology, with the addition of rare metals and minerals. But the strangest thing was that no reflection was found in the shards. They were absolutely transparent, as if they had lost the ability to reflect light. Experts could not explain this phenomenon. The apartment was sold, and the new residents did not report any strange occurrences. The time loop was broken, the nightmare ended. But in the city there remained people who remembered the story of Alexei Morozov and his strange diary. Some of them began to collect information about other anomalous objects created by Vasily the Dark. They found out that the mirror was not the only cursed object created by this enigmatic master. Other creations of his were scattered around the city: mirrors, clocks, music boxes. Each of these objects had the ability to distort reality, to trap people in various forms of curses. And although the mirror from Alexei's apartment was destroyed, other objects were still waiting for their victims. Some paranormal researchers believed that Alexei Morozov's diary was not the product of a sick imagination, but real evidence of the existence of temporal anomalies. They point out that many details in the diary could not have been known to a person who had never been interested in occultism. Moreover, some predictions from the diary came true even after Alexei's death, but most people prefer not to think about such things. They live their ordinary lives unaware that in antique shops, at flea markets, in old houses, objects capable of changing their fate in the most terrible way may still be hidden. They don't know that somewhere in the city there is a mirror that shows not the present but the future, a clock that slows down time for its owner, a music box that plays the melody of death, and every day, one of them could become the next victim. Someone will buy a beautiful antique mirror for their hallway, unaware of its true nature. Someone will find an old clock inherited from their grandmother and hang it in their bedroom. Someone will give their daughter an elegant music box, thinking they are doing her a favor. And me? I am no more. I have completely disappeared without the possibility of reincarnation or an afterlife. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon illuminates the empty streets, some people hear whispers emanating from old houses, from antique shops, from places where Vasily the Dark's objects are kept. This whisper warns them of danger, tells them what happened to me, begs them to be careful. Perhaps it's just the wind playing in the cracks of old houses. Perhaps it's the product of people's imaginations, having heard urban legends. But those who hear this whisper instinctively feel they must listen to it. They avoid antique shops, don't buy old objects, don't accept gifts with unclear pasts. And this is correct, because the evil created by Vasily the Dark still exists. It patiently awaits new victims, new souls to trap in its snares. The mirror that cost me my life and soul was destroyed, but its brethren still lurk in the darkness, ready to turn someone's life into a nightmare. My story is over. I paid the ultimate price for the freedom of others, and I do not regret it. But let my sacrifice not be in vain. Let people remember that there are things in the world that are better left untouched, secrets that are better left unsolved, and objects that are better avoided. Let them be careful. Let them guard their souls. Let them not repeat my mistakes. And if any of them hear a whisper in the dark night, let them listen to it. Perhaps that is the last thing I can do for them from the oblivion in which I now reside. Perhaps that is the only way I can warn them of the danger that lurks in this world, full of ancient curses and forgotten horrors. The story of Alexei Morozov ended, but the story of the evil created by Vasily the Dark continues. And as long as there are people in the world willing to succumb to the temptation of possessing beautiful but cursed objects, this evil will find new victims, create new nightmares, and weave new webs of time and space. Be careful, be vigilant, and remember, not everything that seems beautiful is safe, not everything that seems old is harmless, and not all mirrors show only what is. Some of them show what will be, and some what should not be at all.